Danny Rapaport, love talking to you about golf. As we know, as Ali and I have just been discussing, actually. Thanks for coming on. First of all, looking forward to Ryder Cup week from your perspective. What does it entail?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it for sure. I mean, I think it's. We were just talking before we started recording here. It's a long week because you get that extra day. Usually a major championship, everyone kind of flies in on Monday, which I think is going to be the case tomorrow, and then the golf tournament's up and running Thursday morning. That extra day always feels long. It feels like we've had this competition circled for a half decade or whenever they announced it. It's been like this Ryder Cup at Bethpage Black is going to be something else, and it's finally here. So, I think, and I'm sure we'll get into this. I think the Ryder Cup, from like a X's and O's perspective, is probably the most like overanalyzed. It's almost like both teams have too much time on their hands, and they don't want to let the other team get the upper hand when it comes to preparation. So it feels like every team has done everything possible, and it's going to come down to who makes putts, as it always does in golf. But I'm ready to finally get this show on the road. I feel like we've been talking about it for so long, and it's finally here.
Do you think this is probably the biggest Ryder Cup yet? I mean, there seems to be so much media on it at the moment. It seems like golf is probably at an all-time high with like average golfers getting into it.
I think so. Yeah, I definitely do. I think, anything in New York is going to feel like it's, on steroids. That's New York. That's how it is. I mean, I remember, I think the crowd the last time they had a major at Bethpage Black, 2019 PGA, was one of the best crowds. I mean, we've been lucky enough, all of us on this podcast to attend some really cool golf tournaments. You do well to find a crowd that's more alive. I don't know if, best crowd is kind of comes back to how you define best, but as far as most juice, I think so. I think everyone's going to have a presence there media wise because New York is sort of the hub for all of that. It's not crazy far from the UK and from Europe, and I think the last Ryder Cup that was in the US, the Ryder Cup in general has grown tremendously over the last couple decades, but the last Ryder Cup, the only Ryder Cup in the U.S. that's happened since this kind of post-pandemic boom of the game with casual fans, there were no European fans at Whistling Straits because of all the travel restrictions. So I think this is gonna feel like a totally different level. And Italy was cool; it was amazing. The crowd was great, but Italy is not. It's not England or Scotland or Ireland. It's not it's not a golf crazy country, and it was very cool. But it didn't. When you were walking around Rome, you would have had no idea that the Ryder Cup was going on. I think walking around New York City, I think there will be, I saw they have like, watch parties at Rockefeller Center. And, I think it's really going to feel like kind of the hub.
No, seriously, because you look, you're an LA guy, you're a Cali kid, but you spent some time in New York, when you were working for Sports Illustrated to begin with, etc. You lived in the Big Apple. So really, because when you said that you could walk around Rome and you couldn't actually tell that it was happening, couldn't agree more. You're walking around up the Spanish Steps and all that, lovely place.
Yeah.
But there was no sign of the Ryder Cup happening, just around the corner, which was, telling in many ways. And look, we could go into all the reasons why they had it in Rome and on continental Europe as opposed to, in Scotland at Glen Eagles or somewhere like that. But is that right that you'll be in Manhattan on Saturday afternoon, and there'll be something somewhere that is telling you the Ryder Cup's happening?
I think it's just like every fashion brand's going to have a pop. I think it's going to feel very golfy. I think there's, every store is, every golf brand's having a pop-up shop, and there's watch parties all around, and I think there will be signage everywhere. I mean, I know what the PGA of America is wanting to do is to try to feel like golf, but it is it is the fall, so football is back. Our football, American football, is back, so that's going to take a lot of oxygen. Baseball is kind of coming down to the final stretch here, but I'm hoping we feel some golf vibes out in New York City. Certainly on Long Island, it will feel. I hope you're not staying in the city. Are you guys staying out on Long Island?
So I am staying basically next to LaGuardia Airport. So
okay.
It's
kind of halfway.
Yes, it's not too bad. Ali's actually covering it from the UK.
I'm
sorry, Ali. I didn't mean to. That was not a personal jab there.
It's a sore subject right now.
Let's get into the golf side of things. It's so funny, isn't it, how much things are overanalyzed, like you say, with all this stats and the fact that you've got Eduardo Molinari, who, for those who you were listening, obviously former Ryder Cup player himself, multiple winner on the DP World Tour. He's now some kind of like stats oracle, isn't he, for a lot of the players, actually, way more than you would think. And he kind of inputs stuff into this algorithm and, churns it out, and then he guides players through how to improve them. And Team Europe have basically said, right, he's ours, actually, so we're going to use him. And they make out as if he is this incredible asset in terms of the pairings and, the different sorts of ball flight, and he's going to play well with him and all that kind of stuff. Look, even as a European, Danny, I ain't buying that much. Like you say, it comes down to who's going to hold that 6-footer to keep the match all square going up the 16th and the rest of it. So, from your experience, how much of an onus is there on all that kind of pre-plan?
Well, there are certain boxes that you have to check as far as preparation goes, and I actually don't think that the U.S. checked them in their last 2 Road Ryder Cups. So if you think about the last 2 Road Ryder Cups, the one in France was the week after the Tour Championship, and so all of them played right before. They flew to France like on a red eye. They're all jet lagged. Tiger was dead the whole week, like just had no energy, and then the one in Italy, none of them had played for 6 weeks before. So as long as you're not doing that, I think, you have to check a certain amount of boxes. The U.S. did it this year. They had I think 10 of the 12. The only guys who didn't play in Napa were Bryson because he's ineligible, and Xander had just had a kid. But 10 of the 12 played 2 weeks ago in Europe. I think it was the same, in Napa. I think it was the same for the European team at Wentworth. I don't know if it was 10 or 11, but it was some very high number. Both teams have stats guys. And it was funny. I had Scott Fawcett on, he's going to be on my show tomorrow, and we were previewing the golf course, and he said, optimal strategy is optimal strategy. There's only one. It's like once you reach a certain benchmark, that's optimal. So I think both teams will have that. I don't think that one team will have this. I think the era of having an edge with statistics, it's like everyone's doing it. So you have to do it. You have to check that box. But I don't think that Eduardo has some sort of secret code that the American team doesn't have, and that's going to make the biggest difference. The Ryder Cup is the perfect hindsight is 2020. It's always hindsight is 2020, right? If the U.S. loses this week, people are going to say, Keegan should have picked himself, and that was the difference. And I think he should have picked himself, but that's not going to be the difference. The difference is going to be who plays better over these 3 days, who handles the pressure better over these 3 days. And so I think both sides have done everything they could possibly do. I mean, I saw Europe they got VR headsets on, doing the whole thing. So it seems like I saw a picture of like half their team out at Friar's Head the last couple of days. So I think they all went to Bethpage on Monday, Tuesday, got kind of 27 holes of practice, and they all kind of went their separate ways. Seems like everyone's kind of staying put in the tri-state area. There's definitely good golf to be played in late September in New York. So I think both sides are ready to go. I think you couldn't have asked for more buy-in from the players that they all played 2 weeks before, which is kind of what they would do going into a major. Most players like to play 2 weeks before a major and then, not right up in the lead. So the U.S. not being, not having played across the world a week before or not having played 6 weeks before, we've got that out of the way. So I think we've done we've done what we need to do, and I think both sides are coming in. As you can prepare all you want, but golf is, especially putting, it's binary. The putt either goes in or it doesn't, right? And that's going to make the difference. It always does.
Just straight into it then. Who do you think is going to win? Because obviously I'm not even being biased right now. My opinion is that we have this quite easily. But what is your opinion?
So here's what I'll say. I think the Americans are going to win, and I think the reason that is purely because of home field advantage. I think if this tournament is played, maybe even anywhere that's not New York. I mean, but this Ryder Cup with this crowd, I think the Americans will win just barely. I think it'll be close, and I think the crowd will end up being the difference. But I do think, when we were looking at this a couple years ago, I thought it was going to be a bloodbath because the Americans would be better on paper. And the crowd, I don't know that the Americans are better on paper anymore. The stats are almost a dead heat. And I think for Luke, if I told Luke Donald 2 years ago that 11 of the 12 guys that he had on that team that, delivered a beatdown of the Americans, that's what it was. It was a beatdown. That 11 of the 12 would be back, and that the only one who's different is going to be a literal twin brother who was riding around with his brother all throughout Italy. I think it was Shane Ryan who said this is the first time that all 12 Ryder Cup players are from the same fertilized eggs that they were from the Ryder Cup before. I don't think you could ask for better preparation. They could fire up the group chat. They really could show up with Nikolai and just run the same team back, and probably no one would know the difference. So I think to be able to, and that's why I was so not surprised by the picks. I know our picks were, I think, a little bit spicier because of the Keegan of it all. But I think once Fitz kicked into form, and once Rasmus got the last spot, which knocked Shane Lowry out of an auto qualifying spot. Which really interesting, James. Did you know this? So Shane Lowry told me at Eastlake, I was like, oh, you're going to get knocked out. Like, Rasmus only has to finish 20th. He goes, if I played in that tournament, I would have had to finish 63rd in order to make it. And I said, was there ever a thought that you would skip the Tour Championship and go, and he said, no, absolutely not. So he knew he was going to be on the team. So, right. So I think it was extremely straightforward, for your picks. I think it couldn't have, I don't even think Luke Donald really even had to think that hard about it. And if you're Marco Penge or I think it's Penge, I don't know if it's a Penge or
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, I've been calling him Marco Pengi and all sorts of stuff for years, and then it's Penge.
I mean,
But
if you're Marco Penge or if you're Matt Wallace, you'll feel a little bit disappointed. But I
of
don't
course.
think that any of them did anything. You want to have experience going into this cauldron of emotion. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be something unlike any of these guys have ever experienced. So I think Europe is coming in with about as strong a team as they could have. You could say that Sepp Straka's not really been playing well recently. Shane's not in the best form that he's ever been in. You could argue that, I think if you offered Luke Donald, would you switch out Rasmus Højgaard for Alex Noren? I think he would take it. So that's one sort of semi-negative, but I think from the European team, you couldn't have asked for a much better year.
You know what's funny is that so Dan on Golf, by the way, if you are watching or listening and you've never seen Dan on Golf, I mean I don't know how, because I think if you have any sort of sprinkling of golf on the algorithm,
you do a good job of getting a lot of stuff out there.
it's coming up on your feed, unless like you've had your phone outside in the rain for 2 weeks or whatever. It's absolutely brilliant. And you were kind enough to invite me on a couple of times. So there was myself and there was Luke Kerdanine as well, and we were kind of doing like these way too early Ryder Cup picks all the way through the year. And what was quite amusing was that, your team didn't change that much. I had a little sift through. And apart from kind of like the 11th or the 12th man in, we all got a little bit giddy about Jordan Spieth at the start of the year, didn't we, when he started okay. And we thought we might get better. He didn't. He got worse, etc. But it was quite funny just seeing the consistency of the US team in your mind all the way through the season. We were chopping and changing all over the place, and we ended up with, like you say, 11 out of the 12 from last time.
Well, I mean, if you look at your auto qualifiers, it was a little surprising, right? I mean, Rahm obviously is a special case because he wasn't playing.
Correct. 25th in the standings or whatever he was. Yeah, right. Exactly.
25th in the standings, but a lot of the Ludwig not getting in a spot and Victor, these guys were never in danger of not making it. But I don't think any of us had, Bob McIntyre and Justin Rose getting more points than Ludwig Oberger and Victor Hovland. So it was just, it was just an interesting year on the European side. But you had guys who reached a completely new level. I mean, Tommy Fleetwood reached a new level this year. I think he's in data golf. I think he's the number 3 or 4 player on the planet. We saw Bob McIntyre. We think about 2 years ago, he was sort of a 3-match kind of guy, right? He was kind of
what a turnaround that is. I mean, you say 3-match, that's being kind. Yeah. Because he wasn't. This guy was a run-of-the-mill DP World Tour player who had a good season and crept in. And it was like, oh, goodness, what are we going to do with this guy?
How are we going to fit him in? And now, he's going toe-to-toe with Scotty Scheffler, and almost won the US Open. So he's a guy who I think will play, for probably 3 or 4 times now and feel a lot better about it. So, yeah, it's going to be box office either way. We know that for sure.
We talk about a lot about kind of stats and everything, but how much of the personalities and the players' personalities do you think will come into play this year as well?
I think big time on the European side. I think golf is a very interesting spectator sport because you're able to get as far as meat of the computer basically from the guys who are hitting, and there's an expectation of silence, and those two things don't really exist in other sports, right? You can get really, really close. If you can pony up $10,000, you could sit courtside at an NBA game. There's no expectation of silence, right? A guy's shooting a 3 and you're expected to be yelling at him. There is this magic line that it's pretty remarkable doesn't get crossed more often, especially in the age of gambling, right? The only time I can really think about it was like Tiger on the 72nd hole at Carnoustie. I remember in 2018, like someone yelled in his backswing. That almost never happens. I think we could see that frontier, that untouchable line crossed, and then it becomes, how are you able to control that? How are you able to stay in it? And it's, I think the experience of having 11 of the 12 guys having done it before is going to be massive. And I'd be very interested. I would love to be a fly on that wall in that VR session, because Rory said you can program it to say whatever you want. So what did you have it say?
Well, that is true.
What was it saying to you?
That's going to come out in that Sunday night press conference, win, lose, or draw, isn't it? That is going to be something that is definitely said on there.
It's peek into their soul. Like, what is the thing you really don't want to hear? Or do you have the guts to actually plug in the thing that you really don't want to hear? That's what I'm really curious of. What does Rory McIlroy really not want to hear?
I was going to say, what did you 2 years on now, what do you make of Hatgate? And do you think, how much of a role do you think that played in kind of the spectacle that was Rome?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the team was dead before that. It gave them a little bit of life. They came out with a little bit of fire on Sunday. It was a little bit too little, too late. Look, it was ugly. I think from our perspective, it was ugly. You're playing in the Ryder Cup. The last thing that anyone who's watching sports is thinking about or wants to think about is how much money the guys are making. You're watching. I'm watching Patrick Mahomes on my television, and the announcer's not going to say, "Well, Patrick's making $47 million this year," because it turns people off, right? It actually goes the other way, and that's one of the reasons why I think LIV has really struggled to generate actual interest, because if the interest is how much money they're making, it's not that interesting. So to have that conversation surface when you're wearing the stars and stripes on your chest was not great. They went out and got ahead of it this year. I think they all get like a $300,000 stipend, or I think then they're all, from what I gather, they're all kind of going to donate that. I think it's, I sort of understand it from a player's perspective. I get it, right? Like, everyone's making all this money. I don't think it's like, if you're playing on the Ryder Cup team, you're doing okay financially, right? Ben Griffin made over $10 million this year. I don't think it was like I need this money to feed my family. I think it was, and this might be a pretty American thing of, we're a proudly capitalist country, right? And people don't like to feel like people, they're being taken advantage of. And so that's where I think it kind of stood from. I don't think Patrick Cantlay really wanted that $250,000 in his bank account. I think what he was thinking was, why the hell is this guy making money on this when I'm the talent and I'm not making money on this? But it was still ugly, and they never wanted that to get out. And it was amazing what Jamie Weir's one tweet can do. It was it was actually a very interesting sort of 2020, I say 2025, 2023 experience, watching that tweet go up, watching it spread like wildfire throughout the grounds, because I think the tweet went out during whatever session it was, and by the end of the session, every single person in the crowd knew exactly what was going on.
It was Saturday morning, wasn't it? And then by Saturday afternoon, it was Fitzpatrick and McIlroy against Clark, who was basically a passenger in that match, because it was all Cantlay, wasn't it, on the back nine. And to be fair to Cantlay, he took it really, really well. Look, two points there that I'll sort of put to you there. One is that in Europe, we are not like that. So any chat about money, you'll know this, you're a huge football fan. We'll come on to that, by the way, before we let you go.
Nice result yesterday.
It was, yeah. And I want to hear about your Guinness at 8:45 in the morning. But so there's two things. Europeans, we're weird with money. If you drove a Ferrari down West Palm Beach, people would go, "Hey, nice car." If you drove one through Manchester city centre, everyone would go, "What an idiot." So that's one thing. That's so true, Ali, right? The second thing is that I thought Cantlay wore that pretty well, and he's obviously a very dependable figure in, not just Ryder Cup, President's Cup as well. He's been an absolute demon, hasn't he? That ding dong with Siwoo Kim last year at Royal Montreal was fantastic. What does your average American golf fan think of Patrick Cantlay? Because he's not quite Ian Poulter status, is he?
No.
So what is he?
He's our guy this week. I'll put it that way. He's our guy.
Good answer.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've made this comparison. It might ring a little bit hollow to this audience, as I imagine will be a little bit more UK based. But I compare him to a guy called Draymond Green, who is okay. So he's a basketball player who's been kind of Steph Curry's sidekick throughout the Golden Warriors glory years. And he's the kind of guy who, if you're playing against him, you can't stand him. He's brutal. He's always kind of chatting with the refs. He's getting into it with the crowd. He's flopping all over the place. But when he's on your team, he's an instigator. He's a guy that you want. And I think everyone's wanting Patrick to kind of lean into that villain role a little bit this week.
Yeah.
Look, America loves a winner. Winning solves everything is one of the truest things, that you can say in American culture. Everyone loves a winner. Everyone loves as long as you're on top at the end of the competition. So I think the average American fan is not a huge fan of Patrick Cantlay, and I think he makes it difficult. Obviously, I don't think the broadcast does him any favors by switching to him 40 seconds before he hits the ball, but obviously he shouldn't take that long to hit the ball. I think there's ways to cut around it, but I think that plus his sort of he doesn't really give you much in press conferences. I think that was one thing with Ian Poulter is he wore his heart on his sleeve no matter what the tournament was. So I think there was a little bit more charm there with Ian than there might be with Patrick. But look, the players all respect him very deeply. I think we see all the time games fall off a cliff, right? We've seen it with Jordan Spieth. You even see it with guys like, I'm thinking about the younger guys like Luke Clanton struggled since he got on tour this year, and Nick Dunlap has really struggled this year. And I think when you talk to players, they have a lot of respect for Cantlay's consistency. Basically, the last 7 or 8 years, he's there all the time. And even when he had what I thought was a pretty disappointing year, he still made it to Atlanta. He still the stats are still very impressive. So I think he has the respect of his peers, which is really important on a week like this.
Can I ask kind of more generic question before we get on to like a different side of this podcast? Is kind of what do you think is the perception of English European golfers from the US side, basically from Americans?
I think you guys have an amazing team spirit, which I think is almost dumbfounds us a little bit because they are from so many different countries. And, the international team in the President's Cup has talked about really struggling to build that identity, to get behind the shield, to get behind the international flag. But you guys never seem to have a problem with that. It always seems like, and I know you don't want to read too much into facial expressions, but I just was looking at recently, there was a video of like all the players even arriving to Heathrow, I think it was, to fly over, and they all looked tickled pink to be there. They all looked really excited and really happy, and they had all these smiles on their faces, and it's a different. There seems to be a congeniality between the two, like a sense of warmth, which doesn't mean that they're going to win the Ryder Cup, but they're definitely coming in as one. And I think the consistency factor. I think having Luke Donald back for another cycle. I think having 11 of the 12 back. You guys have really been able to build this sort of family atmosphere that I think, Americans, we're a little bit more individual. We're a little bit more, and I think that's, when I was back at Golf Digest, I wrote a story, talking to a bunch of different old captains about, what is sort of the key? What is the key? And I think the American side, and I think what Keegan Bradley is sort of operating on is let these guys be who they are, right? Let's make this week as sort of normal as possible, right? If you have your physio and you have your guys that you work with on a week-to-week basis, we want those guys there. We want to make you feel as comfortable as possible. I do think there's a little bit more buy-in on the European side. I think there's a little bit more buy-in to the team aspect. Now, does that mean they're going to win? It doesn't mean it. But if you look at the recent results, Europe has been by far the more successful side. And I can't remember who said this, but someone said to me, and I'll never forget it. They said the Americans take themselves really seriously and the Ryder Cup a little bit less so, and the Europeans take themselves not so seriously, but the Ryder Cup very seriously. And I think there's a little bit of truth to that. I think the Americans are easy to rally against, right? It's like these guys, they play, most of these guys live in the United States. They play in the United States. The game has shifted so much, toward the US, just as far as like where these guys spend their time. I think they really look forward to this week. I think it allows them to sort of get back to their roots in a way that they don't get to on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah. You see that when they come over and they play the BMW PGA and all that stuff. They absolutely love it. It's not a case of, let's be honest, they're all getting paid a fee to be there these days, even though it is the DP World Tour's flagship event. They're all getting paid up, little appearance fee. but they are loving it, and that is something that you can't really buy.
They're in the rain, they're in the cold, and they're there for it.
Yeah, they're getting the waterproofs on, shooting 1 over par, which doesn't happen in America unless they're playing in a major. Just a quick one before we let you go. A couple of quick ones. YouTube channel's going great, and it's very much you. I love it. I either watch or listen every week, and I think it's super. Quick question though, because you're a big Manchester United fan, as we've already sort of touched on. 500,000 subscribers, or Manchester United win the Champions League?
They both feel about as realistic as me playing next week at Bethpage Black. I'll say Man United winning the Champions League because I have 500,000 subscribers. I can't even wrap my head around that. That doesn't even feel real.
Why Manchester United?
They were just the best when I was growing up.
Same as all the Brits then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You know, there was always the joke that what is it like most Manchester United fans live in London, but yeah, no, they were, they were on TV. They were the best team when I was growing up, and when you're, a 12-year-old kid, you get every game now. We got every single Premier League game. I could watch all the championship games if I want to. I probably could watch League One if I really researched it, but back then it wasn't really like that, and Man United felt like they were always the ones that were on TV. So
he's a football sicko, Ali. Seriously, like absolutely loves it. Honestly. Danny, I will see you this week. I look forward to it. I'll just leave you with this though. Last time Danny and I were at the Ryder Cup, Danny, as he always does, because he's a fan of Five Live, and Five Live is a fan of him, they always get him to kind of walk round with somebody. And, we ended up walking, I think, 9 holes watching Fitz versus Homer in the singles. And you had the headphones on, and in between all the rugby league scores, the cricket scores that we were giving out, you just worked out that USA, it just wasn't going to happen. And the headphones went off. They went in my rucksack, and you went off, and I didn't see you again for about another year.
Yeah. It's just gibberish. Yeah, you can explain. I've had cricket and rugby explained to me probably 10 times, and I'm no closer to understanding the basics than I was before.
That's fine. Danny, thanks for coming on, mate. Really, really love talking golf with you. Thanks so much, mate. I'll see you this week.
Anytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you.